Welcome to this True Beauty is Good Roundtable on Tarot. I'm Michael Kaup. I'll be facilitating this discussion, and it is a true privilege to be able to bring together the panelists that we have here today to talk about their experience and practice and different words that they will use to describe of how they work with and what is going on with their work regarding tarot. As part of the methodology and way that I facilitate and invite things for a True Beauty is Good Roundtable, there's a lot of questions that there's a working assumption that we as human beings are always living the answers to philosophy, to the questions that philosophy asks, the questions of the nature of the self and phenomenon, of what is right, what is good, what is beautiful, how do we know, and that we're always meeting these in a variety of ways, and that religion, culture, science, these all inform ways that we meet these questions. And in this case, we are examining how tarot comes up in our experience and is guiding us to meet these questions and life and all of the above. We will dive right in here. And the first question will be that of an introduction. So I'm going to invite each of the panelists, please share your name and anything that you would like listeners, viewers to know about you. This could include any characteristics of identity or social location or not. This is up to you. But again, please start with your name. And if we could have, well, I guess I'm saying your name first, could we have Shea begin for us?
Thank you very much, Michael. My name is Shea. My pronouns are she and they. I am an artist living in Phoenicia, New York, which is in the Catskills of New York. I practiced and trained in the Mountains and Rivers Order of Zen Buddhism for 15 years and lived at Zen Mountain Monastery for 10 years, several of those years as an ordained monastic. And I left the monastery in September to return to lay life. And what an adventure it's been. And just briefly, I received my first tarot deck as an ordination gift and promptly forgot about it. And then last summer, when I was going through a whole rupture and dissolution of my life, I remembered that I had them and started using them. And on a particularly painful day when things had officially come apart, I went up to my cabin and did a 3-card pull. And it was the 10 of Swords, the Hanged Man, and 7 of Swords. And I felt so seen in my agony in that moment that is what really pulled me deeply under into my study and practice of tarot. I practice daily and am really do it mostly in solitude. I attended my first tarot circle this morning, and that was the first time I've ever talked to other people about tarot. So I am excited to geek out with everyone here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shea. Hummingbird.
Hi, everyone. I'm excited to be here too and talk about tarot. My name's Hummingbird. My pronouns are she, her. I'm an astrologer. That's kind of what I lead with at the moment. And I use tarot pretty regularly these days in astrology readings, sometimes all throughout the reading, sometimes just at the end. But I find it a really powerful way to just like get a very direct message for a client. And in general, I've been on a spiritual path for about 15 years and studied a Korean energy practice really deeply for about 8 years. And these days, I like to say that I have a mission to bridge the worlds of ascension and activism, especially actually working with the tarot has really connected me to kind of an identity as a light worker, and like a real awareness of the really powerful kind of non-human energies that we can connect to, you know, for evolution and for guidance. But I also, you know, at the same time observe that many, you know, kind of in the light worker community want to run away from the hard realities on the ground, you know, just in terms of inequality in this country and the world, and, you know, all kinds of social justice issues and economic issues and all the problems, basically, right? So yeah, I just feel like a really strong calling to keep working to bring those worlds together and you know, help kind of catalyze a much bigger awakening that I feel like can happen with that. So tarot brings up all kinds of interesting questions around that, because there's so much binary in the decks, right? There's so much heteronormativity, and a lot of even the, you know, traditions that it comes out of have colonial roots, right? So yeah, that's a super interesting topic to contemplate, I think. And I sort of thought there was one. Oh, and just one other thing that I'm starting to work on coaching a process that I call somatic metamorphosis, which is kind of an individualized bridging of ascension and activism that incorporates astrology and tarot and connection with the spirit guides with somatic practices that are designed to kind of break down oppressive systems within the body, within the energy system. So that's kind of a new thing that I'm excited about. So glad to be here. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Hummingbird.
Everyone.
Akiva.
As Michael said, my name is Akiva, he, him. I'm in Brooklyn, and I think probably an important thing to know about me is that I'm not a very serious person.
Excellent. Nagarjuna Metatron.
Hi, my name is Nagarjuna Metatron, and I'm from Mexico City, Mexico, born and raised. I first got my first tarot reading when I was 15, and the cards that came up were the Magician, the High Priest, and the Hermit. So my tarot reader said, "You're a rabbi," and I said, "Hell no." I said, "I want to be an actor." I came out of the closet when I was 15, so I had a deep hatred towards Orthodox Judaism, which is the only brand of Judaism that exists in Mexico. So when she said, "You're going to be a rabbi," I told her, "You're a charlatan," you know. But then I received my first tarot deck when I was 19. I was living in Vienna, and it was the Crowley deck, which you know, Crowley is a very interesting and problematic figure for many reasons. But one of the reasons I liked the deck was that it was, at least the intention was that it was a matriarchal deck. There are no kings. There are only queens and knights. So that was one of the reasons I liked it. And then I did a undergrad at Vassar College in upstate New York in the Catskills. And I studied theater and German studies. I did a whole thesis on how we fetishize money, which is Marx, values, which is Nietzsche, and sex, which is Freud. Then I came back to Mexico. Well, I did my yoga teacher training in San Francisco. I did a 30-day Vipassana retreat at Esalen and a craniosacral retreat. Then I came back to Mexico and worked in the film and theater industry for about 6 years, which really drained my soul. It was not the best livelihood, as we say in the Buddhist Eightfold Path. So I pursued, and I kept studying Vajrayana Buddhism and Dzogchen Buddhism with Namkhai Norbu Rinpoche and Keith Dowman, who's one of his translators, who lives here in Mexico and is a good friend of mine. And then I decided, when my life was falling apart, of course, and a relationship fell apart, and you know, all my jobs were failing, and nobody was paying me, and all my work was being stolen by the man, I decided to, you know, I was living the dark night of the soul. I was living a tower moment. So I decided to just say, you know, burn it all and let's go to Naropa University and get a master's in divinity and just start from scratch, start life from scratch. And I just received an email yesterday saying that I've graduated, that because of the COVID pandemic, there won't be a physical graduation. So they basically said, all right, you've met all the requirements, and where can we send your diploma? So I'm a recently minted Master in Divinity from Naropa University. While at Naropa, I was a interfaith chaplain. I call myself an omni-faith chaplain at two different hospitals, Boulder Community Hospital and North Colorado Medical Center. So two very different audiences. One's very liberal and one's very conservative. Using these words lightly. And I got a very direct experience of working closely with the sick and the dying. And I always tell people when they ask me, what does a chaplain do? I tell them, well, a pastor tells you about their religion. A chaplain invites you to talk about your own religion. And a chaplain is more interested in connecting you with your own source of strength and wisdom, rather than me giving you my strength and wisdom. And so I'm trying to bring that together with my tarot cards, with my tarot readings. So when I do readings, it's not just spiritual direction, which is kind of the modality that the cards lend themselves for me. But I also try and give some spiritual care, because oftentimes I'm giving a reading and people come up with real heart problems, you know, kidnappings, deaths, illnesses. And so it's an opportunity to really dive into that. And I tell them I'm not a therapist, you know, I'm not a, you know, this isn't a therapy session. It is a card reading. I'll finish with this for my introduction. I went to a Chinese medicine doctor in Boulder, and he said, sometimes I tell people, you don't need a doctor, you need a fortune teller. And I tell him, oh, and sometimes I tell people, you don't need a fortune teller, you need a doctor. So I'll end with that. Thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to join all of you and to learn from all of you.
Thank you very much, Nagarjuna Metatron. Fred.
Hi. First off, thank you for having me, and thank you for organizing this. This is a lovely collection of folks, and I'm excited to hear about people's practices. To give you some background on sort of who I am and where I'm coming from, I am one of the co-founders of Catland Books, and I have been reading tarot in varying degrees of professionalism since I was about 13. I also read primarily with the Thoth deck, Crowley's design, and you've given a wonderful summary of one of the reasons I like it so much and why I have struggled with decks that are more sort of the like monarchic sort of Anglo-Christian imagery. As far as my tarot practice, I don't know, I feel like I don't have a daily reading practice. I have a sort of as needed reading practice, and when I'm really good about things, I have a journal where I keep some notes and have that wonderful, joyful experience of going back 2 weeks later and having a totally different view on what the reading was and how I'm interpreting it. So I'm originally from the Northeast of the US. I am currently coming to you from the Bay Area out west, where I have moved for my day job. And yeah, I'm not quite sure what else to say other than I'm looking forward to talking with you all.
Thank you, Fred. Greatly appreciated. So now the next question we have is, what is tarot? What is it for you? How do you describe it? And Fred, would you please continue?
Sure. So when I've taught Intro to Tarot classes, I like to use the somewhat, I don't know, maybe trite but true analogy of tarot as a language. The notion that, you know, this is sort of a dialogue between the reader and the readee, that one can think of, you know, I think can usefully think of the cards as akin in some ways to words or phrases, and the spreads and the sort of structure of how the cards are laid out like a grammar. At least for teaching tarot, I found that a very useful way to kind of simplify it, to get a little more abstract and maybe a little more interesting than sort of Tarot 101 terminology. I think of the tarot as a way to reflect and engage with that which is not consciously knowable. I like to sort of externalize these things in an approach that is, let's say, as accessible to someone who is a theist as to someone who is an atheist. So, I don't think of it as a specific communing with a particular spirit or deity or being. But I certainly approach it as, when I'm reading tarot, I'm a vessel for something that I can't put words to. And the cards are a means to sort of access that perspective on a question or on a situation.
Thank you, Fred. Nagarjuna Metatron.
Oh, goodness. I like to tell people, I really resonate with what Fred said about also making it accessible to atheists. And when I tune in to the fact that people are leaning more towards the atheistic side, and I'm giving them a reading, I tell them that it's just a reflection of randomness, the same randomness that has led us to be sitting here and talking, and that randomness is reflecting itself in randomness, and so that this is just an opportunity to maybe the cards aren't true, but that whatever comes up is an opportunity to see where we land with ourselves. It's a mirror to our own mind. And then when people lean more towards theism, I do say that we are invoking guides, ancestors, ascended masters, or even that, I tell them that tarot is not so much predicting the future as it is revealing karmic seeds, or in Buddhism we call them samskaras, so a seed is already a fully ripened result. It's already happening, but we get the chance, we get the choice to decide whether we uproot a seed or whether we keep watering it or whether we feed it a different nutrient. And I like that language of ground, path, and fruition for tarot. I think tarot is very much traditionally very much like that, like a harvest kind of imagery. And I have much more to say, but I'll let other people talk as well.
Thank you, Nagarjuna Metatron. Shea.
Okay, so I resonate with everything that's been said so far. In my personal daily practice, tarot is a way for me to be in communication with my higher power and with my spirit guides and other ancestors and nature guides. What was just said about randomness, I really sort of resonate with that, in that I think it was Rachel Pollack who said, that in order to actually receive a message from the universe, you have to generate randomness. For example, shuffling a deck of cards. And it was actually, I think, Gail Fairfield who said that when you're shuffling the cards, your autonomic nervous system is putting them in the proper order. And so for me, tarot, after so many years of very formal training, spiritual training, where there is sort of a right way to do things and a wrong way to do things, and you go and sit in front of the teacher and present your understanding and you get the yay or nay, tarot is a me to basically be like, I'm the boss of myself. I have an inner wisdom and power and magic that I can bring out of myself in dialogue with source or spirit or my higher power. And so to me, tarot has been a real invitation to play, to experiment, and to deepen my trust in myself. I also think of it as 78 flavors of the human experience, with each card actually being a universe unto itself. And so it puts a lot more meat on the bone for me than just, seated meditation, which was so much my practice for so long, is that I feel like there's more room for the imaginal, which I don't think got its proper due in my previous spiritual training. The realm of metaphor, story, narrative, the imagination, mystery, non-linearity. And so I did my typical triple Capricorn, like serious deep dive, like study, take notes, and now I'm in a phase of just like opening that up. And that's what I love so much about tarot, is that it's shifting and changing as I shift and change, and it's always meeting me exactly where I am.
Thank you, Shea.
Yeah.
Akiva.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely much more on the like, I guess, tool for introspection side. Even before I got into tarot cards, I would do things like flip a coin and then not look at what it actually came up. And you know, I think there's like a lot of really value in just kind of like teasing out what you're trying to think about, and especially like I think the physicality of it, like the shuffling helps you like focus on the thought. When I do readings for other people, I always like try to like have a little patter when I'm doing that, and not just like, but like that patter is about helping them like put their like thoughts and feelings and intentions into it while they shuffle. I won't shuffle cards myself. I'm always about having them do it, because I think part of that physicality is part of what like helps people kind of get to that place. And for me, again, a lot of just kind of teasing stuff out that like I haven't really like put words into. But I do think for when I do readings for other people, I mean, it's often very much, I think, sort of a therapeutic thing. Like people don't always know that they have a thing that they need to deal with, or they do have something on their mind and they're really just like looking for something to hang on to. So I think kind of making that available to them, even if for me, it's often just like a party trick, is like a kind of a public service kind of thing to do. So.
Thank you, Akiva. Hummingbird.
So interesting to hear all the different perspectives, you know, for kind of a simple question. So for me, just sort of the first answer that comes when you say, what is tarot, is I would call it a divination tool. That's how I use it, for kind of reading into energies. Whether, yeah, it can be anything in the background of a person's life. I sometimes use it to like get a specific, sometimes I use it to look at a past life if there's like a specific reason to do that with a client. A lot of times, like I said, I do think of it as something where there's like a message coming through. But it's interesting because I completely also resonate with sort of the more secular, maybe is a good word, like uses, approaches that everybody is mentioning. And I think, you know, I feel like both truths can exist there at once, kind of like the theistic or non-theistic, or however you want to put it. And I think for me personally, because mostly people come to me through stuff that I put on social media, which is all very like in my kind of language, like light work or language or whatever you want to call it, like a very spiritual language. So I don't really ever get anybody who shows up for a reading who's like skeptical about cards or skeptical about spirit guides or that kind of thing. But I just like, I so appreciate hearing and feeling the other perspectives, because I think that one of the, you know, most kind of therapeutic things about a good reading, whether it's astrology or tarot or any kind of reading, is that it reflects to you what you already know. And it just validates something that you knew inside of you, but your head was questioning, and your thoughts were not trusting your deeper knowing, and you get that reflection. And that can happen, you know, in these, just like you're saying, like when you draw a card for yourself, or if somebody just, you know, picks cards, and you don't have to believe in them. You don't have to believe that it's even reflecting anything true, but you still get that reflection of, you know, some piece of your own energy, right? Because we're actually like all carrying all the archetypes all the time anyway. So I feel like, yeah, it's so applicable, and it's you know, it's really beautiful, the very different ways, different approaches that people can have that, you know, allow it to be used in the most sort of widespread, like overall empowering way that it can be.
Thank you, Hummingbird. And as we cycle through these questions, I have the names of each of our panelists on a card that after the question I'm shuffling, and we are unveiling a random order following each of these questions. The next question we have here is, what is the physical expression, manifestation of your tarot practice? Are there other people involved? Is there a particular spread that is utilized? How do you prepare, set up, and do it? This includes like how you're handling the cards themselves, that tactile sensation, and what you notice about that process. And if we could please, Nagarjuna Metatron.
Well, let's pretend that you are, you know, stepping up to the plate. And so I say, okay, welcome. I say, first I do a smudge, I do an invocation. I do it in Sanskrit because it's a language that really resonates with me. Depends on the person. If I see that they're very Christian, then I might use more of a Christian terminology. Otherwise, I like to set the tone, and it's not just a tone. It is, you know, I say the refuge chant, I say the Prajnaparamita Sutra, I say the Vajrasattva mantra, and then I say Nagarjuna's homage to the Buddha in the Mula Madhyamika Karika, unborn, unceasing, not permanent, not extinguished, not one, not many, not coming, not going. And that sets the room. I also make certain invocations to let them know that we are, you know, we put crystals and incense to let them know that no negative entities are allowed to enter this space, that we are contacting just ascended masters and guides and ancestors, that it is our ancestors who are behind us and impulsing us, our ancestors who are no longer bound by their physical body, but are still with us through our genes and even through our karma. And so that we are working our ancestral karma through these cards, as well as a lot of somatic things that I have no idea. I tell them I have no idea what's going to come up. I'm just an interpreter. The reading is for you. It's not for me. I mean, I'm involved, but really the cards are talking to you. So it's not like I'm going into a trance state and seeing things about your life. All I'm doing is reading the cards. I'm reading the cards as they come up because I've meditated on each card. And so they speak to me in a certain level of feeling. And so all I'm saying is what I'm feeling. And then I check in with them and see how they're doing. What I do is I do first a 3-card spread. I say for truth, for strength, well, por verdad, por la fortaleza, por la luz. For truth, for strength, and for light. Then I do a 5-card spread, which is the directions and the center, which I call the Buddha families, and the chakras, the 7 chakras. And then I do the Kabbalistic Sefirot, the tree of life. And then I do questions and any variation thereof. You know, if they pay for a half reading, I might just do questions, or I might just do one spread. And sometimes, you know, with a 3-card reading, they might get everything they wanted answered. And another thing I tell them is, you know, the cards are talking to whatever is most important to you. So, you know, you might be wondering about, you might tell me that you're coming here to ask about your job, but if you just went through a breakup, that's going to come up. So, and I have no idea. I mean, I'm just reading the cards both individually and how they're relating to each other, visually, sensorially. You know, there's so much information in each card that there's no one definition. And that's kind of what I love about it, that there's a chaotic element to it. And that the chaos is what allows us to dance and make some kind of sense of our lives, which, you know, our left hemisphere wants things to be pigeonholed and be ordered, but life is not like that. So.
Thank you, Nagarjuna Metatron. Hummingbird.
So I always do an opening meditation for a session. So I was thinking about it. I don't know that I've ever done. Did I freeze?
You are with us.
Okay, all are frozen. Threw me off for a second. You can hear me okay?
That's right.
Okay, strange. Yeah, so I don't think I've ever done a formal reading in person for anyone. All my work is virtual, and I've done in-person readings for friends, but I don't think I've ever created a space the way that Metatron was talking about in that same way. But I do have an opening grounding meditation that I do always before any kind of reading, which is just creating a container and inviting in the healed and bright ancestors and spirit guides, to speak if they have information for us, and just grounding into the earth and into the body. And I've just noticed and then also a lot of times I do videos. It's really strange. Can you still hear me?
Mhm.
Yes.
Because everyone's been frozen for a long time now, so I keep like looking at the screen and it kind of throws me off. Michael's frozen in this facial expression that's like very confused, and I keep like catching it and being like, "Is something going wrong?" Oh, yes. So I've just noticed that creating a container is so important. So I'm not quite doing this as regularly now, but I have a YouTube channel where I was doing tarot readings for twin flames for a while pretty regularly. And I would also always do that grounding meditation and open a container before doing those readings. And it's amazing what a huge difference that makes in terms of the kind of quality and directness of the message that comes through, both for an individual and when I was kind of reading like more collectively. Yeah, and then I feel like in terms of the physical handling. Anyone? Can you hear me? Can you
We're
see
just getting you back.
me? Okay.
We lost you for a couple seconds, but we're hearing you now.
Okay, so did you hear me say that I, with my cards, feel like I could do a little better with mindfulness?
Say that, share that with us again.
So, yeah, so in terms of like physical handling of my cards, I feel like I could improve my habits in terms of like paying closer attention. I don't really ever cleanse them. I'm usually only shuffling like while I'm talking to somebody, while I'm kind of like leading into the whatever, conversation that we're having during the reading. Either they're talking or I'm talking while I'm shuffling. And I think something is definitely happening during that time, but there's kind of a level of mindfulness that I would like to, step into a little bit more when it comes to the real like physical way that I connect to the cards.
Thank you, Hummingbird. Akiva,
What was the question again? What is my tarot practice?
the question is, what are you physically doing? Is
Yeah.
there a spread? Is there a preparation for the room? How you're handling the cards? And what you notice about that?
Sure. So I tend to keep a deck just on like my dining room table to kind of fiddle with, and often not even like to do any sort of reading, just kind of like tactile. Like this is a fun, like for lack of a better word, like this is a fun thing to play with. When I actually do a reading, and I try not to do too many readings. I feel like things get really muddy really fast that way. So it's really just like, is there something on my mind? Has it been a while? Am I just kind of feeling it? Then I'll like actually like lay them out again, probably just like on the table or like some piece of furniture or something. wherever I happen to be sitting, and you know, kind of try to use them to wrap my head around some of that stuff. So I have a spread that I usually use that I got some friends in college. It has a lot of kind of a couple of pieces which are like, where have you been coming from, and where are you going, to kind of, I think that's like a good way to kind of anchor. Again, sometimes with like for friends, like often like it'll be like at a party and I'll just like have a deck with me, or like have people over, and then we'll like probably almost always like sit on the floor, and like people will like other people will like crowd around because they get interested, and they also want to go next. So but yeah, I think my cards probably have a lot of like gross like food oil or something on them. So but I also have like, you know, I think like probably several people here, I have a number of decks, and some of them I take care of more aggressively, and sometimes some of them are just like, you know, these are for use, right? Like they're going to get stuff on them. And some are like, these are just kind of artsy and I think they're cool and whatever. So.
Thanks, Akiva. Fred.
Yeah, so I will echo the having multiple decks thing. I think when I started reading sort of at a higher volume professionally, one of the first things I did was get a separate deck just for that. Not so much out of a like feeling of spiritual need to, but that you know, my personal deck was kind of old and grimy, and also, you know, just sort of like the standard playing card size. And if you're not familiar with it, the Curly deck, one of the versions they make is sort of a large format card. And I was reading a lot of like sort of like darker, clubbier kind of spaces. And so having a larger thing that was easily handled and easily sort of shown to someone was an advantage. But getting sort of back to the main question, it's a really hard thing to answer in a sort of unified way, because what I'm doing with the cards depends a lot on the situation. If I'm reading, you know, just for myself, I probably won't do like a super formal sort of like space setting or consecration or banishing of the space. I'll certainly sit down and kind of, you know, have a meditative moment with myself and kind of get to that clear-headed space before doing a reading, if it's for something a little more, you know, important as questions go. With other people, and I guess I think if I'm going to sum it all up, the sort of unifying thought is, I think of each reading like a very small ritual, and the details of that ritual depends a lot on, you know, who the audience is, what the purpose of it is. So with myself, I certainly tend to be a lot more casual unless it's a, you know, very kind of high stakes reading. With others, you know, I've done everything from incredibly laid back single card readings for tips at like a back table at an event, to very formal, you know, hour-long multiple reading readings for people or for couples in a sort of dedicated reading room space. And sometimes those are people I know, sometimes those are total strangers. And I've got to say, I think one of the biggest changes reading professionally was going from reading either for myself or for people I knew, you know, at least a little bit, to reading for people I knew nothing about. Because even though, you know, my sort of philosophy on it is I try not to, you know, what they call cold read. I try not to sort of bring in my knowledge of my own situation or that person or people's situation if I have sort of knowledge outside the reading about it. I tend to read in a very sort of, let me tell you what these cards are and how I sort of see them and the pattern in which they're laid out, as opposed to a sort of, you know, let me read what you've told me about yourself or things like that. But then it always slips in a little, no matter how hard you try with someone who you know, whether that's yourself or someone else. So I think if anything, the readings for others, particularly for strangers, I do a bit more ritual in the opening of it. little bit more of sort of a space setting and an intention setting. In part because, you know, you're working with someone else, and I know what I know, you know, what I need to get into sort of the right mindset to receive.
Here.
We are going to, all right, when Fred comes back to us, we will check in with Fred again.
Oh,
What's that? Oh, fantastic.
hello.
Welcome back, Fred.
You all froze up for a moment.
You froze up for a moment.
Could you say again what you were just sharing?
Yeah, what was the last bit you caught?
You were talking about when you know what you need to sort of create.
Oh, sure. So like I know how much formality I need to get myself into that sort of space, but I don't know that for another person, and it's very hard to know with someone, you know, especially a stranger, where you don't know where they're coming from or what their practice is or isn't, or what they believe or don't. So I tend to get a bit more sort of formal in setting a space for the reading. Rarely is it sort of like, you know, a full, you know, belly spoken banishing and a smudge or anything, but sometimes, depends on the person. I've got a bit of an intro spiel that I tend to give to people receiving a reading, just about, you know, here's kind of how I approach the cards, here's how I approach readings, just to give them like a little bit of background to how I read, because I find, you know, everyone does it a little bit different, and I've definitely had people come in sort of with a very preconceived notion of what they expect a reading to be, and I found it helpful to get ahead of that and say, like, look, you may have had the other ones, here's how I do it. During the reading, I you know, the spread I use depends on their question. I try to adapt it. I've got a few go-tos, but I try and be fairly intuitive about it in terms of how to lay the cards out in a pattern that's going to work for the question they're asking. And then towards the end, I like to make clear, because sometimes people, you know, especially if they're approaching it from sort of a more ritualistic sense, I always like to encourage people at the end to take notes or take a picture if they'd like to. Because I know from my own readings, when I've like actually taken the time to sort of sketch out the spread in a journal, with certain questions, it's been very helpful to go back like a week or two later and think, oh, well, I thought that meant this, but now, you know, that and that happened. And I find that helpful. So I try, and I find people like sometimes are so caught up in the experience of reading that they forget that step. So I like to remind them that's okay. And sort of give a second or two of space if they want to record it in some way to do that. I think as far as other sort of habits with more intense readings, with shuffling and handling the cards, I have kind of a go-to process for that. I will get myself into, I describe it as an incredibly mild trance state, and sort of shuffle the cards, repeat the question or some phrasing of it to the cards very quietly with them kind of close to my mouth. And then if it's reading with someone else, I'll hand the cards to them to split, so that there's sort of both people's hands handling the cards and having a role in that sort of randomizing process. But I think that's the only sort of set physical practice that really is consistent, you know, across readings.
Thank you, Fred. Shea.
I have a personal daily practice that I do, and that happens in the morning. I do about 20 minutes of liturgy before that. And then I sit down at my space and I do a service before I pull the cards. And after I do the service, I'll just sit quietly for a few minutes. And then I have my physical ritual of unwrapping the cards and shuffling them in the way that I shuffle. And I do a body, mind, spirit pull every day. And I initially worked with curating a collection of women readers who I really like and respect, pulling in this is when I was first learning, pulling in their meanings into a notebook that I keep. And I would, part of my magic is distillation. And so I would distill meanings into my notebook, and I would use that for my reading. And I did that for several months as I was sort of internalizing these different women's, interpretations of the cards. I've shifted that to just actually going through and describing the card with no interpretation, just describing the visual elements of the card. I use the Wild Unknown deck for my personal readings. And then I free write after that. And that's kind of how and then I distill those entries into just a couple words that I use actually as my guidance for the day. So that's kind of my personal practice. On the first of the month, I reorder my deck and do a Celtic cross for the whole month. And that's kind of how my personal practice works. When I read for other people, I actually don't do very much talking. Michael, you may appreciate this just from being familiar with the monastery. After living there for 10 years and generating no income and having no credit when I left, there was a question of like, okay, how do I monetize 14 years of like dining hall practice, of like sitting with people and like having the most sort of like getting in their life and death conversations, like how can I make a living? And tarot kind of became a device for me to do that. It became a way to initiate an intimate, a way for me to hold space for a person to initiate an intimate conversation with themselves about a question or some aspect of their life. And so really I do very little. I don't really talk much about traditional meanings. I really try to draw them out about what they are seeing. Sometimes people don't know where to start. I might just describe it visually, and then people just kind of fall into it. And my job is to just ask questions, pull out themes that I hear, reflect that back to people. Much like Hummingbird was saying, like I really believe people have the answers to their questions inside of them. And my role in a reading for another person is to really just hold space for them to make meaning and to tell a story that is going to be useful to them. And I used to do invocation and a service before a reading. I've gotten very casual about that. I like to kind of disarm people and be very ordinary. I guess it depends on who I'm reading for, but I really don't have a lot of, I try to set people at ease. I shuffle the cards, and during the shuffle, we're refining the question together, so that the question is not a yes or no question. The question is about them and their power, and not about what's happening with another person, and that the question's affirmatively framed, which sometimes takes some doing, but I feel like that's really important to cue the subconscious. The subconscious doesn't pick up the not or the don't. So getting people to understand that it's important to be able to state what you want to know affirmatively. And so I feel like 80% of the reading happens in the shuffling and the refinement of the question. And the rest is just really creating a sense of trust and safety that a person can really talk to themselves out loud and hear themselves reflected back. So I guess that's it in a sort of a nutshell.
Thank you, Shea.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in your practice of tarot, what is your role or identity in this process? And is there a specific word that might describe that role and what you're doing in that process? And Fred, would you begin for us?
Sure. I think there's two roles that come to mind, and the first and most important one is I think of myself as a conduit. I couldn't quite put words to for what, but for what the cards are trying to say, I suppose, the message that is to be delivered to the person receiving a reading. And when I think of sort of what my role as in a reading is, it's first and foremost to sort of get that message across to the person asking, to the querent, in a way that will be understandable to them, but also accurate to sort of what the cards are saying. I don't try and oversimplify it in any way. And as a secondary role, particularly for folks who haven't had a reading before or are not particularly familiar with the tarot as a system, part of being a sort of good conduit for that answer is also a bit of teaching and explaining kind of what these cards are, what I'm seeing sort of in the deck, while leaving room for them to create a dialogue there. It definitely changes a lot depending on how familiar the person is with the system. And I'd say, like, I've had even folks with sort of a passing awareness of the cards and tarot as a tool, I've had really profound dialogues come out of just kind of talking through the pattern in a given reading and what's come out of it. So yeah, I'd say those are sort of the two roles that I come to it in.
Thank you, Fred. Shea.
I think I spoke, a little bit about this, I guess, in my previous answer, but that I'm really creating a space, a container where a person, I think a lot of it is about creating a sense of safety, about being able to say anything. I sort of had this reputation at the monastery where I would sit down for breakfast with a person who was there for the weekend, and invariably it's like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm telling you this. I never told anyone this before. And I think that I just have something about me that people feel like they can say things. I have a good poker face, and not just a poker face, but an invitational, I am here to witness you, and so I feel like my role is to really just create a space where people can feel free to kind of say the thing that's actually on their mind. I mean, I'm not a therapist, and I don't claim to be one, and I'm not doing that kind of work. And at the same time, there is an element of, really holding space for people. So that's how I feel. That's what my role is when I'm reading for other people. When I'm reading for myself, I feel like my role is a combination between being sort of an antenna and a child. That's something that is not, that childlike, sense of freedom and play is something that I'm only coming to really later in life. And so my role is to really loosen up and let it in, and don't let someone mentioned, don't let the left mind kind of take over the whole space before the other side has had a chance to have its say.
Thank you, Shea. Nagarjuna Metatron.
Pardon my casualness. I'm at home. We're all in quarantine, no? Well, actually, my MDiv thesis was called "The Oracle as Pastoral Giver and Spiritual Director." So I like to use the word oracle. And in the thesis, the part one of my thesis is called Methodology, the Oracle, and part two is called Hermeneutic, the Union of the Two Truths, which is Mahayana Buddhism, or Madhyamaka. And part three is called Mental Illness, Psychosis, and Art, which is kind of bringing the whole thing together. So just to stick to the oracle, I like that word, and I talk about the Oracle of Delphi, and I talk about all the different kinds of divination that have come up historically. I mean, even the ancient Egyptians used to read cards. They weren't tarot, but they were cards. Shamanic traditions of all kinds have read anything from tea leaves to crow feathers to mirror divination, like the Tibetans. And I think even like modern, like we can read our pee, like what's it called, orinoterapia. People, there's doctors that can read your pee and they can divine like what you're deficient in and what. So I think divination is everywhere. I mean, it's symbolic, and so the cards are just a very fancy way for pee divination, orinoterapia in Spanish. It has a different word in the therapy where you drink a little bit of your pee. I don't know alternative medicine. But so there's this anyway, in the thesis I talk about the oracle, and I talk about the most iconic, I think for me at least, pop culture reference for the oracle, which is in the movie The Matrix. And in the movie The Matrix, they risk their lives to go visit the oracle to find out if Neo is one or not. And they arrive, and they're greeted. This is a recap for those who've seen the movie. Even for those who have seen the movie, they arrive, and in the antechamber, there's all these kids that are doing all these psychic things. And there's this kid bending the spoon, and he tells Neo, it's not the spoon that bends, it's your mind. And then Neo comes into the oracle, and there's this thing that says, know thyself, above the door, which is what is above the Oracle of Delphi, the historical oracle. And the oracle's just baking cookies, and she's like, oh, I tell you to sit down, but I know you won't. And then she says, and don't worry about the vase. And Neo says, what vase? And as he says that, he knocks over a vase and breaks it. And he says, I'm so sorry. She says, oh, it's okay. I'll get one of my kids to fix it. He says, how did you know? And she says, oh, honey, what's really going to bake your noodle later on is, would it have broken if I hadn't said anything? And so there's this element of prophecy as well that we're playing with. But there's this question of, would it have happened if I hadn't said anything? And we don't know. The causes and conditions that lead us to this present moment, are inseparable from the reading, from the shuffling, from the question that you're asking. As you ask the question, as you receive the card reading, you're changing your karma. We are changing your karma together. And so I just want to end this question with a quote from Dzongtsar Khyentse Rinpoche. He says, there is no free will, there is no predetermination, and there are no accidents. And that's the middle way. We want there to be free will. We want there to be predetermination. But life is not that straightforward. There is an unknowing that's happening all the time. And I think the cards are helping us put a name to the unknowing in a very, haphazard, freaky, and yet very intelligent design.
Thank you, Nagarjuna Metatron. Thank you. Akiva.
Yeah, so I think I mentioned I really like to make sure that someone else does all the shuffling. I kind of try to pull myself really out of it and just, Fred mentioned the conduit, but I would say even more just more of a even maybe a mirror or a very well implemented instruction manual for someone to do them themselves. But I don't ask people what their question is, because if I know, then I know I'm going to know a lot too much about putting myself into it, and probably guide them a little more than I really want to. But at the same time, I've been kind of rethinking that, not because I necessarily think it would be any better or worse, but because it's less fun for me. I want to know what people are doing. I want to have more of a dialogue about it. I'm normally a pretty low-key person, but there's something that happens that turns into a bit of a performance, where just you kind of, I think probably people know what I'm talking about, where you get kind of just you're on. And I think engaging with that is super fun. And so I've been thinking about if I ever see another human being again, trying to do a little bit more of that kind of back and forth. I mentioned patter, and for me, some of just things I are you know, that same sort of like, I'm having an interaction with someone and we're going back and forth, and it's really hard to do that if you don't know what they're on about and you don't know, you know, what is going through their mind. So yeah, I've been thinking about kind of redoing some of that just because I think it will be more interesting, for lack of, yeah. So even
Thank
if
you,
it puts
Akiva.
a little bit more of me into it.
Thank you, Akiva. Thank you very much. Hummingbird.
There's so many interesting threads of what each person has shared that I kind of want to respond to in this question. Simply, I would say I think of my role as two things, like messenger / interpreter, which is similar to conduit, I think, and then also space holder. And I just to speak a little bit to what Akiva was just talking about, and what a few people have mentioned a few times, like this idea of, do you do a reading cold? Do you want any information about the person versus do you go back and forth and whatever? And so, like, as an astrologer, I, you know, pretty early on, really, I developed the style of asking my clients a lot of questions as opposed to just telling them what the chart says. So like I'll, you know, it's very intuitive every time, but I'll look at the chart and we'll start to talk, and maybe I'll tell them a little bit about, you know, a few things in the chart, and then I'll ask, how does that land? And I'll ask, where do you see that playing out in your life? And we'll like get into a conversation and we'll go from there. But I definitely, you know, have a style at this point that is very much back and forth, and so the same thing comes through in tarot. Yeah, so it's really it's so interesting, because I do think that there is, sometimes you get people, right? Sometimes I get clients who are a little bit looking for me to like prove myself, like prove that I'm a real reader, that I can like figure things out about.
It's a good pose.
How accurate things are. Can you guys hear me? Everybody's frozen again.
You were out for a bit. You
we
were
lost you
doing
just
this.
after figuring things out.
Figuring things out.
That the person you're meeting, if they're trying to figure things out.
Trying to figure out if you're legit.
Right. That they want to show. They want me to show, prove to them that I'm a real like psychic or reader or whatever. And it is interesting because you, especially with cards, like the YouTube readings, most of the time it would be relationship readings. So people would you know, sign up for a recorded reading that's like telling them about their connection with somebody else in their life. So I would read that person's energy, and like I would have an intake form that was optional. So sometimes they'd tell me a ton about the person and their life and their situation, but other times they'd tell me nothing, like only a name. You know, and I would be doing a recorded reading, so there wouldn't be any interaction with the person, yet, you know, the readings would be like, there have been so many times where, you know, I'll pull the cards and it'll be something so specific that I'm like, could this possibly be, like, if it's accurate, it'll be really accurate, but if it's not accurate, it'll be totally wrong. And I'll kind of say that, and I'll read it in that specific way, and like it's right so many times. So it's interesting how you can really approach it from both ways, and both ways can, you know, be effective and helpful. Although I think, yeah, I just think that I think there are some readers out there, and I don't have this feeling about any of you, but there are some readers out there who are very gifted psychically, but who really rely on that as opposed to cultivating themselves more as a way, you know, as somebody that can interact and go deeper with a person, right? Because you can just talk. Like, I could just talk for a whole 60 minutes to somebody about the cards, and I could just give them all this information, but that's not necessarily gonna really help them do the work that needs to be done, right? That's not gonna really help me show up as that mirror. And then also just space holder kind of second as a role, but I think that's so important too, and several people have named this, but that you know, you're in one way or another, you're often getting a pretty deep look at somebody, and what comes to the surface may be something that, yeah, they haven't quite touched yet. They haven't quite gone there, and it may have roots very deep back in their life. It may be, you know, something triggering or traumatic that comes up. So it's a whole other interesting question that I've had with a lot of astrologers and young astrologers or astrology students, because you get trained in this reading ability, but depending on who you train with, or a lot of people are just kind of self-trained and they start offering readings, but they don't have experience holding space, and they're not trauma informed, and they're not really, you know, don't know how to handle it when something very deep comes up like that. So I do think that's a super important, you know, intention for anyone to hold when they're doing a read, especially in a, you know, a private context. It can be different if it is more of a public space where things probably aren't going to get that deep. But I feel like if somebody, you know, an individual, right, or even a couple, like, they're trusting you to, like, look, right, to see something that maybe they can't see themselves, then yeah, there's really a responsibility to train, you know, to hold space in that way.
Thank you, Hummingbird. Next, the question is there knowledge that is sought through tarot? What is that knowledge or information that is sought? And then how do you recognize it as such? Like, how do you know or recognize its truth or its validity or importance? And Nagarjuna Metatron.
I'll be brief about this one. There is no knowing. I tell people there's no knowing. There's a feeling. And the only way to know is to see for yourself, as the Buddha says in the Kalama Sutta. You know, and I think I'd like to bring in a card, because we haven't brought in the cards at all. And I'm gonna bring in the Osho deck. Osho is very controversial, I know. I also am not on board with everything he's done, but his deck was made by one of his students, and it's very beautiful. And the reason I like it is because it goes beyond the good and evil binary. And so let's just see what kind of card comes up. So we get this one, right? And so this is traditionally the King of Cups. And it comes up like this. And this is kind of how I read too, you know, like, see for yourself, you know, this is what the card is saying. There's no knowing. It's just information. And then if we get another one, we got this one, which is the Osho card. A lot of decks, they incorporate an extra card. In this one, there's this one. So this is the 79th card, so to speak, which this one represents the transcendence of concepts and dualities. And then lastly, we got traditionally the 9 of wands, which is usually, like, for me, like a, you know, hold back, hold space, be quiet. But in this one, it is a guy who's so exhausted from working the machine that he just needs a break. So there's no knowing, you know. That's my answer. That's my opinion. Like they say in The Big Lebowski, that's just like your opinion, man.
Thank you, Nagarjuna Metatron. Shea.
I just had sort of like an insight in the course of the last like 15 minutes. When I was a massage therapist, I conceived of my work as like, you come in and you tell me what you're there for, and I do what I do to you. It's like one of those like 19th century tinctures you could buy that's like a cure-all for everything. It's like, this is my thing that I do. And there's an element to that in my mindset about tarot, especially when I'm reading for other people, that I really think that, like, and this, I don't know how this is going to sound, and I'm just sort of talking out of my neck at the moment, but, you know, I think that we suffer, like, because we hate ourselves. And I think that so much of work and why, like, this is, you know, very much my journey, and like what I see in people is that, you know, the parts that we don't want to see, that we don't like about ourselves, that we project outward. And so to me, it's like, how can you let it all in, whatever's coming up, and love it? And what does that mean? And in my own, like, personal practice, I write about a card each day on my Instagram feed. And I think that there's, you know, that the truth is that if I can go very deeply into my experience of what I see this card pointing to, someone else will find something of it. Like, the more thoroughly you go into your own personal story, you find the sort of larger truth in it. And so for me, tarot is a lot about, like, telling a good story, and not in a, like, an advertising kind of way, but like in a healing, the deepest sort of healing way is to tell a good story. And a lot also, you know, and this may seem tangential, but it's not to me, is that I also feel like another truth that I am drawing out of myself and in other people when I read for them is, you know, there's the deeply personal, and then there's the aspect which is inseparable from that, of our socialization and our conditioning. And Hummingbird, I think, spoke to this in her introduction of herself, that, you know, the extent to which I hear, when I hear people talking, their capitalist conditioning, their white supremacist conditioning, their patriarchal conditioning, and to just kind of hold that, you know, to just kind of name that for people. Like, is your question about needing to be more productive? Like, if that's what you want to know, like, that's what we'll do the reading about. But I just want to reflect back to you that that question is based in, you know, this idea that your life is about what you produce, you know. And so my own study of the extent to which I have been impacted by my socialization, dehumanized by my socialization, and am rehumanizing through my political and spiritual work, that very much is another truth that I'm trying to bring to both my personal readings and what I do for other people. If that
Thank you. Absolutely. Thank you, Shea. Fred.
Oh, perfect. I was hoping I was gonna get to go next. I was gonna add to your last point. I think some of my favorite readings have been people who came in with one particular question, and somewhere between a third to a halfway through the reading, realized that that was coming from completely the wrong space, and sort of realized mid-reading, oh, well, I asked about that, but actually, like, as we've gone through these cards, here's this huge thing that I, like, wasn't even realizing was connected to the sort of superficial question I walked in with. And it's such a magical moment to see, sort of to be with someone for that kind of realization of what's sort of underlying their space. But yeesh, knowledge. I think, you know, in my sort of approach to the cards, I think there are three types of knowledge that come out of that practice. And I don't want to get into the certainty question, because I think I also fall into that category of, more or less, there's no knowing for sure. There's knowing about, there's knowing of. but I don't think of certainty as a goal of any sort in most of my spiritual practice. So I can't really speak to that. But in a reading, I think, for me as the person sort of handling the cards and, as the reader of them, one piece of knowledge that comes out, and maybe it's almost so obvious as to go without saying, but I feel like the more I read, the more I know about the tarot and my relationship to it. The better my knowledge is, not just in a sort of rote, here's what this number in this suit means kind of way, but in the more sort of deep intuitive sense of, what is this tool? What do I do with it? How do I, use it in a helpful and meaningful way for people? That knowledge I find comes out of this practice, but almost inevitably. The other knowledge I sort of hope comes through in readings I do with people, is that sort of reflective knowledge about their question, about what they sort of came in looking to find out. Not necessarily knowledge in the sense of having answers, but knowledge in the sense of having explored something more than they might have been able to in other contexts, or differently than they might have been able to via other methods. And then finally, and I think, I don't want to get too far afield in our sort of working definitions of knowledge. But I think for both parties to a reading, I hope for and often see greater knowledge of self come out of that, as it tends to out of any sort of reflective practice. But I find the tarot to be an interesting one, because it often comes about not quite so obviously as a more sort of introspective, directly reflective work. Sort of almost like sort of the readings I was talking about at the opening of this, that notion of people kind of suddenly realizing a connection they wouldn't have thought about if not for the reading, and having that knowledge of themselves and sort of how they're wired on a level, or how they're thinking or approaching something on a level that is, I think, can be a struggle to reveal without something like the tarot that has that sort of randomness and intuitive aspect to it that can kind of bring unexpected things into the fold.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you very much. Akiva.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question, after I do a reading for someone, I don't ask them, did you learn something? I ask them, was that helpful? And I think that is kind of the important thing for me. Like, if I'm doing something for someone, and then obviously I do it because I find it helpful. And I think that helps me understand things. And so if that knowing stuff, I think for like a useful working definition, like I have a better idea about how I feel about something. I put some things together because of this randomness or whatever. That is sort of very functional. I think into this, there's like a more aesthetic joy too, but like, I think there's like fundamentally, like, I do this because I get something out of it. I will say, usually when you have someone who's like haven't had a reading before or whatever, they're like, tell me what's going to happen. And I'm trying to be very clear, that's not the thing I'm trying to do. So.
Thank you, Akiva. Hummingbird.
Yeah, so I think I would use the term information more than knowledge, especially if we take knowledge to mean like something that's certain and set in stone. Definitely what's coming through in a reading is not that. Yeah, I usually think of it as acquiring information. So sometimes you might be acquiring information about another person or about a situation, right? Somebody's job situation or their family situation. Like you might be using the cards to peel back a you know, kind of veil, maybe like peel back something that was energies that are hidden by other layers of action and other layers of information, right? So in that case, and I just, like when I am opening a space, I'm always setting the intention that the information that comes through is empowering and of service. So then I, you know, obviously that's my intention too when I'm speaking and reading the cards. So, you know, I feel like in any situation, there's also, you know, any question you might be asking, the amount of information you could get is infinite. So then I kind of like am giving it up to spirit to decide what information we need to know right now. So if we're asking a specific question about a relationship or a situation in a person's life, the reading's not going to give us the whole picture, right? We're not going to get the whole truth from that, but we are going to get information that is going to, you know, help this person make a decision or help them have a better sense of where they're at or how things got to be the way they are, whatever it is. Like spirit is going to give us the information that is, you know, kind of from a higher perspective is what this person needs right now. Yeah, so I'll just keep it simple with that.
Thank you, Hummingbird. Now, the question is, what are you drawn to aesthetically? How does artful representation affect tarot and your process? And how do aesthetics or perhaps representation impact it? And can we start with Fred? Can we? I will recapitulate that question because I believe that Fred just returned to us.
I lost you also during the whole question.
Did I?
You just went muted for me. I don't know. Maybe it's my internet. It seems to be going out pretty regularly. Just
Am I back?
I heard you totally
coming through
fine.
now?
I can hear you fine.
Okay, fantastic. Fred, did you hear the question regarding aesthetics?
I did.
Fantastic. What could you start us out?
Yeah, sorry. I heard the question. I didn't hear who was on first.
Oh, sure.
Because I jumped up to grab my deck.
Fabulous.
So I think that the things that grab me most and speak to me most are the more sort of emotive decks. It's one of the reasons why I have been reading with the Thoth deck for so long. It has these very like, they're almost like abstract, often very angular imagery in the cards, with sort of very intense bright colors. And I find like in the headspace I get into when reading, that sort of emotive quality to the artwork is something I find much easier to read with than, you know, say like the Waite Smith style, very kind of earth tony, more sort of, I don't know, almost like medieval art style decks, which is not to knock them. I know people who read with them and have had incredibly powerful readings from people with them. It just doesn't, it's not a symbolism I speak as well, I guess is the way I'd put it. Shea, I think you mentioned the Wild Unknown deck, which I've never read with, but is also one of like my aesthetically favorite decks in the world. But it also has that quality of, you know, the sort of very intense black and white with bursts of color kind of imagery to it. You know, as far as like the aesthetics of the deck itself, I find it easiest to read things that have that sort of vivid intensity to them. And I think that comes back to kind of the broader question of how I read the cards, which is, you know, with the Thoth deck, there is a very like formalistic, you know, here is the planetary and zodiac association of this card, and you can absolutely read like just the straight like numerology and associations of a particular card in the deck and give a coherent reading. And I try and do sort of 50-50 that and intuitively sort of what jumps out at me in the card, what sort of piece of this whole kind of design of that particular card speaks loudest. And that latter half I find much more enabled reading with decks that have that sort of intensity to them aesthetically.
Thank you, Fred. Hummingbird.
Yeah, I've been on a search since I started tarot for decks with really channeled artwork. And I found many, cute decks with like artwork that's very attractive, but then it's not really, there's not a lot of depth in it. So my favorite deck that I use for like kind of looking at main energies is the Psychic Tarot by John Holland. And these cards are just like, they're just like rich with imagery. So I'll see things in them like still now, like that I've never seen before sometimes when they come up. And these cards have like, because the imagery is so rich, there's like a lot of information that comes through. So it can be like, I don't really do complex spreads usually. I usually just have a few cards, like I'll just usually see kind of a format in my mind to put a few cards down for. And then I'll use these as like kind of main energies. And then I'll use other decks for clarification. And so, yeah, I like the most, this one is called the Shadowscape Tarot. It's like very, I don't know, dreamy, shadow world, fairy tale kind of imagery, but like not like happily ever after fairy tale, like the real kind of fairy tale. And the Osho deck I also really love. Yeah, and then I like having all my decks here, and a lot of times I'll get in my head like kind of direction to use a specific deck, and then when I pull the cards, like it'll be, there'll be something in the illustration that's like very specific to that deck for that card that's relevant for that person, which is always cool. But yeah, I'm always on a search for decks with really high quality artwork. So I'm, if anyone has recommendations, I always love to hear.
Thank you, Hummingbird. Nagarjuna Metatron.
So, wow, yeah, I resonate with a lot of what's being said. I want to just give a little tidbit. This was part of my thesis, that tarot, as we know it, of course, there's so many theories because there's no way to really know it. But one of the main iterations comes from 13th century Spain, which is the same time that Kabbalah comes up. And it's because of the Spanish Inquisition, because they were persecuting different religions that weren't Christianity. So they needed a way to encode all of the teachings, Tarot and Torah, which is the law, or Torah. It's, so they needed a way to encode all of these divine sacred teachings. And so to practice religion without practicing, so that when the guards came and said, "Are you practicing heresy?" people could say, "No, we're just throwing cards, la baraja." And baraja in Spanish is baraja is card, and baraja in Hebrew is the blessing. So we're just throwing the baraja, I really resonate with psychedelic artwork. That's just my personality. I have a really psychedelic personality, and I really like spirit medicine, and so it just speaks to me. I like the Crowley deck because it throws at you, Kabbalah and astrology and all of this. And I really like the Osho deck for the same reasons, because, well, I like the Osho deck also because rather than getting the suit of pentacles, you get the suit of rainbows. And so that's a way of saying, in the Osho deck, it says, it's like Earth has been lifted into its divine, or it's, we could say more subtle or more refined, because the earth is also divine. But we could say the more, loftier versions. And I learned this trick from someone. I've been doing something my dad told me. He said, just be a mystery shopper. He said, get as many card readings as possible, which is not something I suggest for people, because you often get the energy from whoever's reading. So I don't suggest you try as many card readings with whoever. But I decided to do it because I'm crazy like that. And I learned a really nice trick from someone that I've been trying to incorporate, which is I let them choose the deck. Sometimes they say, well, up to you, and then I use whatever I want. But I say, well, you choose a deck, and then I have a little deck for myself. And so in the middle of the reading, often, I'll say the word channeling for all intents and purposes. I'll be channeling, I'll be excited, I'll be saying, I see, there's this party and there's a wedding. This card is a wedding, and there's the Prince of Cups, and so you might meet someone at this wedding, and then they say, is it someone from my past, or is it someone I already know? And they kind of like zap me in the middle of my channel. And I'm like, well, your cards don't actually tell me that. So then I have this backup deck, and I just draw one card. And then the cards may or may not clarify in the moment. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. Akiva.
Yeah, so I think like my day-to-day deck is very much kind of a Rider-Waite-Smith kind of style, this Palladini deck, which like looks very similar, but like is a little more vibrant, I would say. But I think at the end of the day, you're trying to look for symbols and like aesthetics that you respond to, rather than like, or like that's sort of how it goes. Like I'm not super into psychedelic imagery, for example, and so things that kind of look more like that are just like not my thing. But I think this is probably a useful time to tangent into. I actually made a deck pretty recently, which was kind of a funny experience. This was not a thing I like set to do like really on purpose. This is, Michael also heard the story. I think Freddie at least got a little bit of it. But a friend of mine actually wanted to have a party at IKEA for her birthday, where we just go do a bunch of weird different activities. And I was like, oh, I'll do fortune telling, I'll do tarot reading. And then I was like, oh, what if I made an IKEA themed tarot deck? So I like went to IKEA's website and like looked through all the assembly manuals and like pulled out a whole bunch of images. And so you can see stuff like temperance. And I actually went and did readings with this deck at IKEA in one of the rooms. But the interesting thing was, I had to make up a deck, right? So I had this like vague idea, and I sat through, or like I was like stared at like, what are all these cards? What are they meaning in this context? And that was like a really interesting exercise in terms of like, how do I want to relate to all of the cards? And two, I got a little lazy. So I didn't do like custom meanings for like every single number card, because, oh my God, that would have been a lot. So I did like pips, like a normal playing card deck. And what I found was that, so like, here's like, again, like here's some angle, some Allen wrenches, 10s, right? There's 10 of them. But what I found was that it was really a really easy deck to work with, because instead of having to worry about like the meaning of every single card, you just really have like the emphasis. So like, oh, the suit means this thing. You're getting a lot of that feeling. And people, I think, really responded to it really easily. Like it was just like very, like everyone knew these symbols. They were very simple. And they didn't, I think, scare people away in a way that a lot of like tarot symbolism might. Like it was like symbols from like modern life or whatever is I guess what I would say. So I thought that was pretty like an interesting experience. So
Thank you very much, Akiva. And as a side note, Fred commented that he's had some interesting experience using Akiva's deck in readings. And after the formal roundtable, we'll see about a little addendum to be able to offer you that experience if Fred wants to share and stay. For now, can we hear from Shea?
So I use the Wild Unknown deck, and over the course of the time I've been using it, I've established such a relationship with it. It's intense, my relationship with this deck. I think I have other decks and I think about using them, but I just always go back to it. I've been on the fence about getting the Thoth deck, and after hearing you all talk about it, I'm thinking that I might have to try it. My study, revolves around Rider-Waite because, Pamela Coleman Smith was a genius and, embedded so much meaning into those images, and those images have accrued meaning, have collected meaning over time, such that they are very powerful. And so it is helpful for me, I think, to know that. This is the Three of Wands from the Wild Unknown deck. And this is a card that in studying it, I had like this huge insight about my childhood, that this combination of structure and freedom is like so perfectly expressed in this card, that it's something that's given me a lot of power, to see how these horizontal lines and then this very strong frame is what allows me to enter into that imaginal realm. And, I, coming from sort of a patriarchal religious tradition, Zen is great. It's super patriarchal. I have really leaned toward decks created by women and studied books written by women about tarot, because I feel like I was sort of starving for hearing teachings in a feminine voice. I love the Wild Unknown because there's no people depicted in the deck. And I find that much easier to enter because I'm not dealing with my reaction to, gender. I mean, there is, mothers and fathers and daughters and sons in the court cards, but not seeing depictions of actual people, with white skin or other kinds of skin. It makes it easier for me to sort of enter the energy of the card. And so I think aesthetics are super important. And what's so amazing is there are a kajillion decks, and, people to see other decks, it's like a person is expressing like, this is my understanding of the Three of Wands. You can, and every time you look at a different Three of Wands, you're turning the jewel and seeing different facets of this card. Representation matters. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Shea. Thank you very much. Next, we're moving towards ethics. The question being, what responsibility do you hold as a reader of tarot? And within that, is there a right or wrong? What is good? And what kinds of ethical parameters do you hold within that? Not to mention what kinds of counsel then from that standpoint do you offer to others? And Hummingbird.
Oh, one of my favorite subjects. Yeah, so I think with tarot and with any kind of divination practice, there are a couple, what's the right word? I don't know. There's a couple of different elements, kind of ethical, maybe issues, subjects. Anyway, there's a couple different places where I think it's very important to align yourself as a reader. So maybe first is a real awareness of the power dynamic that is created between myself and a client or anybody who I'm reading for, which is really an awareness that, like, when people come themselves, and maybe did you guys lose me again?
For a second, we have you back.
Okay. Yeah, I think that even people who maybe have gone to therapy and done other kinds of self-work, even people who are generally pretty like sovereign in themselves, will often show up to a reading with a little bit of that surrendered, or maybe even a lot of that surrendered, because they view it differently when you're, it's a spiritual practice, it's somebody with a like, spiritual gift or whatever. Like, I don't really even like to use that term, because I think that the kind of reading capacities, of course, you can get somewhere by studying just the basic like information of the archetypes, but then there's also is a more kind of spiritual, intuitive side to reading that one can develop, but anybody can develop that. It's not a gift, right? But people come with a different level of expectation. And anyway, what I'm getting at is that people show up with their minds very, very, very open, very, very, very suggestible, even people who maybe typically aren't like that in other areas of their life and other people they're interacting with. So I feel like, the more you start to recognize that as a reader, the more it becomes your responsibility to be proactive in making sure a client or somebody you're reading for is staying in their sovereignty and is not just taking everything you say as pure truth. Like, that's something that I think a good reader is going to be doing that proactively, right? Not just waiting for the person to say, oh, that didn't really resonate, right? You have to be really asking, right? Like, how's that landing for you? And what do you feel about this? And does that feel accurate? And, being on top of that, I think is really important. And then, yeah, the other element where I just have a very strong opinion, maybe ethically, or what the responsibility of a reader is that these are tools that need to be used intentionally for liberation and justice, for collective, healing work. And so it's something that in astrology frustrates me a lot, because there's so much pop astrology out there. There's so much astrology out there that is just designed to give people, it's clickbait basically, but even if it's accurate, the way that it's delivered is designed to give people like just a little dose of certainty or a little dose of reflection, but it's just enough that it doesn't really make them question anything more deeply, right? It's just enough that it like, maybe they feel, oh, I'm a little spiritual because I read my horoscope, but there's nothing in there that makes them question, white supremacy and heteropatriarchy and the, economic injustice and all these things that are bigger issues. So I just have a really strong opinion that anybody who is using divination and doing this kind of work has a responsibility to be on that journey yourself of unpacking your privilege, unpacking your, cultural trauma, unpacking all of these layers that we all have, because you can't help somebody else do that if you're not doing it yourself, right? And then also to hold that intention in the space of a reading, or if you're somebody who does collective readings or whatever, to be holding that intention that I'm gonna use these tools, responsibly, and I'm gonna use them for really truly the good of society, and not just making somebody comfortable, not just creating a situation where that person's going to want to come back to me because I, told them what they want to hear, right? And it can be very tempting, and it can be almost a default to tell people what they want to hear. And especially if you don't have other kind of training, right, in space holding and being with uncomfortable, experiences, like holding space while somebody else is feeling something uncomfortable. If you're not trained in that, then as a reader, like, you're going to just default really fast to interpreting the cards as something that makes a person comfortable.
It's really important. I'm going to I'm going to move us to, in the interest of caring for time, and I'm going to ask for those that are these next 4 answers to this question. I'll ask, can you offer a 1-minute answer? It's not fair. It's a challenge, but also one that has it really offers its own poignancy in offering that. So, Shea, can you share with us how you meet this question?
I just want to echo a lot of what Hummingbird is saying about, that doing my own spiritual work, my own, and by the way, Hummingbird, thank you for energetic justice posting. Thank you, I'll just say that I'm responsible for continuing to do my own personal work, my larger work around my socialization, and that I am holding, someone is coming vulnerable with a question about their life, and that's a sacred trust. Al-Anon recovery has helped me really learn how to stay in my lane and be with someone in their lane and understand, what my role is. I'm not fixing anybody's life. And I take the ethical component, as serious as a heart attack, because I think it's inseparable from everything else that's happening. Thank you.
Thank you, Shea. Thank you very much. Akiva.
Sure. I mean, you always have an ethical responsibility in everything you do, I feel like. But in particular, I think people kind of touch on this, like people are making decisions based on stuff you say. And so anytime, whether it's tarot or just like giving your friend advice, like you have a responsibility to like tell them things that you think are true, or, what you think will be helpful. Obviously, like there's helping them help themselves, and then there's like, oh, you need to do this. Those are kind of different things, and you're much more on the helping. I think in this situation, you tend to be much more on the helping them help themselves. But like, I think, for example, that's one of the reasons I'm very explicit about like, this is not about the future, except what you bring to it. Like, don't make a decision because you got this card unless like that's the decision you feel like you should make. So.
Thank you, Akiva. Thank you very much. Fred. Fred, could you unmute yourself?
Yes, I
Fantastic.
can. Sorry. Let's see. Let me start that whole sentence over. I would strongly echo what folks, Hummingbird, particularly what you said about sort of bringing both the personal and the more systemic ethics into reading and tarot. I think let me keep it brief. I think it is very much an intimate sort of counseling situation, and I approach the ethics of it somewhat similar to more mundane forms of counseling or advice giving, which is I need to be truthful. I need to be as honest and open and direct as possible. And I want to empower this person to kind of hear and engage with and understand what is being said and what is being sort of communicated, without sort of echoing what others have said, without it being sort of, without them walking in with the impression that I am somehow sort of their voice of truth or their fortune teller, to give them sort of the empowerment to understand what the reading is, and to kind of carry that reflective power away from that space.
Thank you, Fred. Nagarjuna Metatron.
Of course, there's a right and wrong when we're talking about ethics, and there's an accountability and a responsibility for being in the presence of someone, whoever it is, because there's power at play. There's privilege dynamics at play all the time with social location. There's vulnerability at play, and we have to be accountable for the vulnerability of our own hearts and for the vulnerability that we're being trusted with, or with the resistance that we're being trusted with. That's also very valuable too. When someone is resisting, that is a boundary, and we need to honor that, I feel. as healers, or whatever we want to call ourselves, as just friend, even if we're just friendly advice, because they're projecting onto us some level of authority. Even if they think we're charlatans, they are still, there's still a power play happening. And so, because even people who say, well, I believe in it a little bit, well, you still believe in it a little bit. So I like to use nonviolent communication language. I invite, I offer, I reflect, using I statements. I really like what people said about, I don't want to take away their agency. I don't want to take away their sovereignty. I don't want them to make sometimes they ask me questions like, should I leave my husband? And I say, that's not a question for the cards. If you want, we can review what the causes and conditions are that are leading you to feel this, and what kind of path will unfold if you take certain decisions. But I said, please don't give me that kind of power, please. And I just want to end with a little story. I was doing an oracle, tent of oracles. It was by donation, and all donations were going to charity, and it was $5 for 5 minutes or something. And I was reading this woman's cards, and she was asking about her ex-husband or something. And the tower came up in his head. And I said, well, he seems and the fool, I think. And it all was inverted. And I said, he seems, from what the cards are saying, he seems like he's a little bit crazy. And she just starts crying, and I mean bawling. And she says, no, you don't get it. She said, he's a schizophrenic, and he's in a psych ward right now. So there's a tremendous, responsibility that we have. We don't know how what we're saying affects the other person. We never know the impact of our words. And that's why we need to have that ethical commitment with ourselves to continue our practice in whatever form or modality it may show up. But this was a wonderful question, and I'm glad that it was asked and that it was answered so wonderfully and multifacetedly by everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you. As we close here, I'll offer one final question and invite a one-sentence answer. How would you say, in one sentence, how this practice, how tarot affects how you see and show up in the world? And Shea, would you step forth on all our behalf first?
I will step forth with one sentence, and then I actually do have to duck out because I have to start this other meeting in a second. Michael, I just want to thank you for the incredible job that you did moderating, and what a pleasure it was to meet all of you in this way. I'm so touched and moved by this whole conversation. Tarot makes me, helps me greet the world with a question.
Thank you very much, Shea, and thank you so much for joining us. It's been such a pleasure to have you.
It's so nice to meet all of you. Please take good care.
Cheers. Nagarjuna Metatron.
So what was the question again? One sentence?
This is, in one sentence, how do you express how tarot affects the way you see and show up in the world?
Tarot has provided me with a language and a framework with which I can organize my chaotic mind.
Thank you. Thank you. Hummingbird.
I have very similar words, a language and a framework, and especially the archetypes in tarot just tap me into a deeper truth and a way of understanding this human situation.
Thank you, Hummingbird. And Fred.
I would say that tarot provides a lens to view a situation or a question in an unpredictable, sideways way that I find incredibly enriching.
Thank you, Fred. And Akiva. Akiva, would you? Yes.
This is a hard question to answer. So I'll just say sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words.
Yes.
I appreciate that. Um, Thank you so much to each of you. I'm so grateful for all that you've shared and your generosity in being here, in everything that you've offered. So this will conclude formally the roundtable. And then I will start the recording back up for a bit more free flow. Fred, if you'd like to stay on, I'd especially love to provide you an opportunity to say how it was to work with Akiva's deck. And then also, if there's final debriefing conversation that those who are staying on would like to engage in, there'll be an opportunity for that as well. But here, this will conclude this. Thank you so much to each of you. And there will be links for those who are listening in order to get in touch with all of the amazing panelists that you've gotten to hear from today, so that you can follow their work and learn, enjoy, delve, question, all of the above. Take care, everyone.